teams. On the affirmative side, Victoria University of Wellington Team 1. Round of applause. On the negative side, the Australian National University 1. My name is Chris, I'm the chair. Joining me is Irina, Will, Eleanor, Imran, Monique, and Kareem down the end. So if I could ask everyone to kind of maintain a bit of decorum during the debate, but given that we're incredibly close to the speakers, you can feel free to tap your legs and do what you need to do during the speeches. So without any further ado, I'd like to call the first speaker of the affirmative side, Emanuel, to open the esteemed space.
It is essentially fraud, Mr. Speaker, when the most wealthy in our society, the most powerful companies, the people who have become rich from profiting from the everyman, are able to use the way in which our judicial system is currently structured, the way in which our tax codes are currently structured, to make sure that the law does not apply fairly to them, to make sure that they do not carry the same burden as every other person in society does for making sure that everybody has enough and that the state can function adequately. What we're going to achieve on this side of the House is fairness, and here is how we're going to do it. We're going to have clear tax codes with very general anti-avoidance provisions. Those anti-avoidance provisions will be interpreted by the tax office at the first instance, not a judicial body. They can then issue a tax bill if they believe that somebody has been avoiding tax. That person then has to pay that tax bill at court order if necessary. Like any executive function, what the tax office has decided will of course be subject to judicial review. What I'm going to be doing in this first speech is talking first of all about how this is going to function by changing the way in which our judicial system systematically fails to collect tax and restructure that towards a more efficient means of collection via the tax office. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about how this policy is going to direct resources away from what we think is a fundamentally inefficient avoidance industry and away from people who are wealthy and just creaming off the inefficiencies in the tax code. Finally, I'm going to concretize the outcomes and show you what we're going to be achieving at the end of this debate. Jodie's going to split, talking about how this makes our progressive system all the more progressive. Let's go then to that first substantive point. What I want to look at first is how state prosecution through the courts is fundamentally an inefficient way of trying to get tax. Because right now, if the tax office decides that somebody is in violation of one of those general avoidance provisions, what they have to do is go to court and try and force at court that person to pay their tax. They have to make out a case that that person is in violation of the tax codes. The problems with that are numerous. The first one is that creating a prosecution is incredibly expensive. In the public service, you quite often have horizontal pay structures, which means you don't necessarily have the most well-resourced or the most skilled lawyers at your hand, as compared with those who are able to pay absolutely whatever they want in order to get the best representation. That disadvantages the state. Second thing is, the courts are generally rather blocked up, right? And these are issues which are incredibly complex, which these companies have spent a very long time trying to design all sorts of very, very intricate means of avoiding taxation. Take, for instance, Mr. Speaker, the Irish-Bermudan double Dutch sandwich, right? Which is where you register in both Ireland and Bermuda in such a way that you are resident in neither country and you store tens of billions of dollars, just as Facebook and Google are doing there right now in order to avoid the tax that they would have to pay in the countries where they actually earn their money, right? Those are incredibly complex instruments which judges are generally ill-equipped to understand. The third thing to say is that the burden of proof in these situations is placed upon the state. They have to prove that the person is avoiding the tax, right? Which makes all of the work in the prosecution have to be done by that party. The final thing to say, in terms of why this is somewhat more difficult for the state, is that there is very little in the way of international agreements about sharing information on earnings and taxation, right? Which currently advantages the companies because they're able to send in the Pacific region their money to small like Pacific islands, or in the northern hemisphere off to like Bermuda and the like. And the problem is that all of the tax information is held in those jurisdictions, which makes it very difficult for courts in the country where the prosecution is occurring to try and get that information out of those other jurisdictions. The reason is that there are complex procedural issues and jurisdictional issues, which means that the prosecution has difficulty getting the court to demand that information to be released from those countries, and that systematically advantages the company. The last thing to say is in terms of statutes of limitations, right? Because these also work in the favour of companies. The longer they can draw out that court process, the more they can delay the state by spending endless amounts of time in court, the closer and closer they come to crossing that glorious bar of the statute of limitation and running away with their tens of billions of dollars. We say that's bad because these companies don't pay enough tax. That should be intuitive enough. Let's look then at how the tax office, if it's able to just identify of its own accord whether or not it thinks something is avoidance and bill the person, is going to be a more effective way of making sure that money comes towards the state and towards the people. What the tax office is going to do is get the vibe on whether or not they think there has been avoidance. They'll issue the bill based upon their understanding of the code. Why is that better? Well, unlike courts, the people who operate in the tax office are often themselves experts, right? So they have a much more effective and efficient way of just identifying whether something has been probably avoidance. Secondly, while we're willing to say that there's going to be judicial review, we think it's much better that the judicial review is of the tax office's decision after the bill has been issued and paid, rather than to even get the bill issued in the first place. Why is that? Firstly, it overcomes that informational problem that I was talking about before, because while previously it was the responsibility of the state and the prosecution to try and get that information out of the foreign jurisdictions, now it is the company who has to bring all that information about their earnings, about their tax structures, into the jurisdiction where the prosecution is happening, right? Because they are trying to prove that they have not avoided tax, and that is their job. So that information is more likely to flow, and if they have not been avoiding tax, then they should be able to prove that. It should be their job to bring that information in. The second thing to say about that is that we think that the company generally has a better idea of whether or not they are in fact trying to avoid the kind of tax which they're expected to pay, right? The final thing to say there is that the burden of proof is now on that individual, and they have to expend the resources to discharge that burden of proof and show that they have not avoided tax, rather than the state having to do that. And because these companies are generally far more well-resourced than the state is in trying to deal with these taxation issues, we think that it's generally better that they have to discharge that burden of proof and expend the resources to go that far themselves. The last thing in terms of why a tax office is going to be better at setting these kind of things interacts with that statute of limitations problem that I talked about earlier. Because if your incentive is to drag things out for as long as possible, that delays the amount of time in which it takes to set a precedent and clarify exactly what the point of the tax code is that should or should not be avoided and is caught by that general avoidance provision. The tax office issues a directive and says, that was avoidance, you should pay us that money. That precedent is set immediately, and all other companies will be following that precedent until it's successfully judicially reviewed. We don't think that's likely for tax office experts, and the way in which it shifts the burden pushes the incentives onto the company to not avoid. Let's look at the next substantive point, and this is about how we direct resources away from what is a fundamentally inefficient avoidance industry. Because on the side of the house, we think that's a wealth transfer to wealthy accountants and lawyers who work at the behest of these companies. Delay no longer wins in this situation, right? Which makes it less of an encouragement for you to spend as much money as you can on lawyers dragging this out in the courts, because you have to pay that bill. You don't have to, you can no longer rely on that statute of limitations, right? Now, because the burden has changed, you only are incentivized to go after review if you think that you can actually prove that you have not been avoiding tax, rather than the other way around, where your incentive is to make sure that it lasts as long in the courts as possible and you can hold off on paying that money until the statute of limitations is out. And the most important thing about this, Mr. Speaker, is that it creates an abundance of caution, and we think that that's generally more efficient. We think this should be like a generally plausible point, that it is easier and it is less resource intensive to, in good faith, follow the tax code as it is written, rather than to expend excessive resources in trying to devise things like that Irish Bermudan double-duck sandwich, right? That requires a lot of law time, that requires a lot of accountants, as compared with following the tax code and the precedents issued by the tax office in good faith, such that you're unlikely to be identified as avoiding. Let's talk then about outcomes. We think these are quite simple. Less avoidance and less of what is essentially fraud. More resources for the state. Less resources tied up in a fundamentally inefficient industry which rewards only the wealthy. This is a debate about fairness and security. If we're going to talk about rule of law and the way in which our legal system should operate, it should affect all people fairly, the rich and the poor alike. We propose.